Distinguished guests, fellow engineers, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Johnny Chirk, and I'm very honored to be your MC this evening. Thank you for coming to the second ICE Distinguished Lecture. We have received a very overwhelming response, and you can see we have a huge audience here with over 500 people. Before we start, I suggest we take a group photo. All you need to do is to sit back and relax, maybe with a big smile, and our professional photographer will do the rest. Thank you. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Tony Sham, Chairman of the ICE200 Distinguished Lectures, to say a few words. Tony, please.
Our guest of honor, Mr. Frank Chen, Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mrs. Sylvia Lam, Director of Architecture Services, Dr. T.C. Cheung, Director of Buildings, Mr. Edwin Tong, Director of Drainage Services, and other distinguished guests, fellow ICE members, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the institution, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Apart from many other celebratory activities, the Hong Kong Association of ICE has decided to organize a total of 3 distinguished lectures throughout the year, each with a different theme. At the first lecture, back in March, Dr. Robin Sham and Dr. Anna Ruiz Terang showcased to us excellence and innovations in long-span bridge worldwide. And today, we're shifting our focus to Hong Kong's infrastructure developments over the past half-century. Hong Kong has a superb infrastructure which meets its population's needs and contributes to the efficiency and growth of the economy. Since the beginning of the 1970s, Hong Kong government has invested multi-billions of dollars every year in the development of infrastructures in order to keep the city to be a modern, competitive, and super convenient world-class city. Civil engineers have no doubt made significant contributions to Hong Kong's infrastructure developments. We are all the invisible superheroes. "60 years ago, in the month of September 1958, a young engineer from the UK first set foot onto a construction site in Hong Kong for the Gun Club Barracks project. And 33 years later, in 1991, he was appointed the Secretary for Works of the Hong Kong government. And these are just 2 out of many remarkable stories and achievements throughout his 60 years of involvement with Hong Kong. And you all know I'm, of course, talking about our keynote speaker today, Engineer James Blake, or better known to the general public as Jim Bak Lok. In a short while, James will share with us his record of the city's worldwide recognized achievements in infrastructure developments in the past half-century, and he will also highlight to us some pointers to the successful delivery of complex and multidisciplinary infrastructure projects. And this evening, we are indeed very honored and delighted to have the presence of the Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Frank Chen, as our guest of honor. We all know how busy the Secretary is from Everyday's News. And we are very grateful for his presence this evening to give his support to the institution and to us all. And without further ado, it gives me great pleasure now to invite Secretary Frank Chen to address us with some opening remarks for the event. Mr. Chen, please.
Chairman Sam, Mr. Blake, Professor Ho, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm honored to be here with you, awaiting eagerly to learn from James, our most respected speaker tonight. Since the genesis of the planet Earth, Mother Nature has continuously evolved and shaped the global landscape. Over the past 4.5 billion years, she has created many natural wonders. Humanity is no match for Mother Nature. But over time, humanity has innovated and built many engineering wonders. Over time, humanity has transformed the global landscape and shaped the way we live. From the Grand Canal in the mainland, linking the Yangtze River with the Yellow River, to the Panama Canal that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, from the Channel Tunnel that carries high-speed trains from Britain to the European continent, to the Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong Express Rail link that connects Hong Kong to every corner of our country. All these are nothing but examples of the many monumental engineering projects that were completed at different times. The value of infrastructures is way beyond their forms and functions. And more importantly, the contribution in underpinning growth and sustainable development, be it local or global. Today, we have 5,000 ports, 18,000 commercial airports, 1 million kilometers of railways, and 36 million kilometers of roads built across the globe. Together with telecommunication and IT infrastructures, all these not only enhances connectivity between people, but also seamless flow of cargoes, capital, and info. Hong Kong has been ranked first in infrastructure for 8 consecutive years by the World Economic Forum. This could not have been accomplished without the dedication of engineers. At a time when we are celebrating the bicentenary of the Institution of Civil Engineers, I would like to pay tribute to fellow ICE members for your contribution in making Hong Kong great. As of today, Hong Kong has one of the world's busiest container ports. Our airport stands atop all other international airports in terms of cargo handling capacity, and being the world's 3rd busiest airport in terms of international passenger traffic. Our railway and road network carries 222 million of passengers across the boundary, and we have the most efficient public transport system in the world too. All these world-class infrastructures have helped sustain growth, development, and prosperity for Hong Kong. The lecture tonight is most timely and relevant when we are contemplating mega-scale reclamation projects to provide land for housing, social, and economic development for Hong Kong. And especially at a time when immense opportunities are forthcoming in the Greater Bay Area. The community is earnestly looking upon us to ensure successful completion of infrastructural projects, both new and existing ones, such as the free one-way system, which Kelvin is looking after, the Kowloon Central route, and the many railway lines in the pipeline. In closing, I must thank James for sharing with us the success story of Hong Kong's infrastructural projects in the past 50 years. I am sure your experience and wisdom would be our guiding light on the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. May I now invite Mr. Tony Sham again to introduce our distinguished lecturer. Tony, please.
First of all, thank you, Frank, for your opening remarks. And by the way, congratulations to the soon opening of the high-speed rail. I look forward to experiencing that in the not-too-distant future. Our keynote speaker this evening, as we all know, is engineer James Blake. James first arrived Hong Kong in 1958-59 as Army site representative in the Gun Club Barracks project. And I was told he was involved in a swimming pool at the junction of Chatham and Austin Road. 6 years later, in 1965, he returned Hong Kong as site representative with Scott Wilson for various government works, including the Cross Harbour Tunnel approach roads. In the following years, he was with contractors involving in many major infrastructure projects, including the MTR initial system, Choi Hung to Kowloon Bay, and the Island Line Quarry Bay section, and also involved in the Eastern Harbour Crossing, Island Side approach roads, and many others. In 1991, James was appointed Secretary for Works of the Hong Kong government, heading the various works departments. And during his term from 91 to 95, he was involved, and just to mention a few, in the overall coordination of the Airport Core Program, policies on slope and site safety, and interim agreement with the mainland on the way forward for Hong Kong's sewage disposal strategy. And I have the privilege working with James for short whiles, both before and after his time as the Secretary for Works. From 1997 to 2012, James was Senior Director Works of KCRC, responsible for the West Rail and East Rail extension, linking urban areas with the new towns, and also the second boundary rail crossing. More recently and ongoing, he has been involved in the reference design to tender stage work of the Kai Tak Sports Park, as well as project review of the Ocean Park Water World. Beyond doubt, engineer James Blake has made exceptional contribution to the infrastructure developments in Hong Kong, and he is also the first engineer from Hong Kong who received a gold medal award from the institution in recognition of his contribution to our profession. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you Engineer James Blake.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for setting the scene so well tonight. We have enjoyed a professional collaboration in the past. I'm delighted to see you here today. Thank you, Tony, for those kind remarks. I did suggest you should keep it short, but there we are. Now, tonight is not about history. It's about trying to learn something from history, trying to learn why it is we have been successful. And we've had our failures, we've had our rough times, and I'm sure some of our present rough times will have to go away in the future. But we've learned from the past, and I hope that from tonight we can pick up some of the key points. My own philosophy is to keep it simple. There's an old English saying, keep it simple, stupid. And it's very true. The more complicated you get, the more difficulties you create for yourself. So this evening, what I would like to do with you all, it is a privilege to be with you all, is really to take a little bit of a stock of what we have achieved, as our secretary has said, but then to consider what I consider to be three key pointers. One of them is fitness for purpose. If there are lawyers in the room, they will quiver at the term fitness for purpose. I'm sorry, but as project engineers, it's something that we must keep at the front of our mind. And coming from a sort of strong railway background, it is even more important. So fitness for purpose is one of the pointers. The second is really command and control. I believe that in Hong Kong, we do quite well in this area, but on the other hand, I believe that we do fail from time to time. The third is what I consider to be perhaps the most important of all, and that is trust and transparency. Too often, we become concerned about protecting our own interests or our so-called client interests. We forget that our opposite numbers are probably doing the same thing, the net result of which is that nothing happens, or whatever happens is really a fruitless exercise in frustration. So those 3 pointers, fitness for purpose, command and control, trust and transparency. I'd then like to look forward a little bit, the challenges and opportunities, some of the innovations, and perhaps not innovations as such, but common sense thinking that has presented itself, and then at emerging technology. I don't want to be complicated tonight. In fact, I'm too old to be complicated. I'm a simple person. But there's no doubt that emerging technologies, to my mind, are going to make our lives more constructive, and in fact, we will be able to achieve more clarity with the powers of digital processing which is in front of us. And then last of all, I'd like to illustrate some of that by way of a short video presented kindly by Thomas and Gammon, dealing with how they are applying BIM at the Ocean Park Water World, which you see on the screen in front of you. But I would hasten to add, Thomas, that picture was taken a long time ago, at least 2 months. I can assure you the project is very different today. Walter is in the office, he will bear me, and Nigel is in the room as well. They will all bear me out. That picture is well out of date now, but it was the only one that we had. So, let's move on then to our second slide, if we may. Just consider this. The green represents the institution of civil engineers. It is, as you see, a completely worldwide organization. The little red dot is London. I remember going to that red dot when I took my examination a long time ago. And that is our headquarters. But the rest of the world is the world of civil engineers. It's the world of civil engineering as far as ICE is concerned. And we have, I think, to thank Douglas for the work that he has done with the mainland in making sure that ICE and our mainland counterparts are working harmoniously now and hopefully into the future. The words of civil engineers in our institution, the engineering in the service of humankind. I think the actual words are mankind, but I always change it to humankind because we are in the 21st century after all. Engineering in the service of humankind. That is what we do. We try to bring the great powers of nature and usefully employ them, as Mr. Secretary has said, and we will increasingly be doing that. Our home is the world, and of course we in Hong Kong are well represented. These economies, as we have learned, Hong Kong sits right at the top there. How could we achieve that? If we go back one slide, please. That was Hong Kong when I arrived, at the bottom. You can just about see where the bank was in the middle. You can see where the Hong Kong Club sits, my second home down here. I'm afraid I've taken the Hong Kong Club down and rebuilt it since then. But this is the waterfront. This is the waterfront today. The Hong Kong Club is still there. You can just about see it in there. And the bank, of course, is tucked away in the background there. So this represents from my time of arrival in the 1960s to where we are today. And that is why, if we go forward, we are where we are. The top engineering infrastructure in the world. And what is particularly interesting to me is that countries like Japan, like Switzerland. Switzerland has a similar topography, more demanding than us, probably. But we have managed to get where we are despite our topography. Singapore, always a competitor, but then it's fairly flat down there. I mean, engineering is fairly straightforward. And I say that having worked in Singapore. But no, Hong Kong is where we are. And I think we should congratulate ourselves looking forward. Where have we come from? Look at the next slide. This was Hong Kong around the 60s when I arrived. By the way, that was Kai Tak. And it's quite interesting that the old Kai Tak passenger terminal was a long, low building, single level. And as I will remind you later on, John, that was where our planning design came from for our present terminal. Everything is at a single level from the time you get off the aircraft until the time you arrive at your immigration desk. It worked then, it works today, and congratulations. You've kept it working that way into the future. Tai Tam, the water supply, has always been one of Hong Kong's major infrastructure developments. Interestingly, still drive across here, as many of us do. This was the hillside. And it stayed like that. I can still remember in 1991 as Secretary for Works, there were the remnants of hillside squatters that we had to deal with. And of course, Shep Kip Mei Estate, one of the early walk-ups that were built in response to the need to get people away from this environment into a more decent environment. So that was the early part of our infrastructure. Moving on, we moved into the Cross Harbour Tunnel. Built using steel cans, floating them out. We sank one of them, and then we packed it up again. But they're still there, and they still work efficiently. The Eastern Harbour Crossing, I'm pleased to say, was built perhaps a more conventional way. But interestingly, the largest units as at that time in the world, two-lane highways for road and a double lane for the railway. The opening of the MTR in 1959, the second harbour crossing. And of course, Sha Tin New Town, one of the early reclamations. A lot of problems with that reclamation, in fact, because there was quite a lot of underlying sediment. I remember John Endicott telling me the problems that they had in trying to resolve But they did, and it's still there. So this is our early infrastructure. Moving on then to what I consider to be the foundation stone for the whole of Hong Kong's infrastructure to where we are today. In other words, the Airport Core Program. This was the initiative of, I think, primarily two strong men, Governor David Wilson and a retired military senior officer, David Ford. They realized that what Hong Kong needed, of course, was primarily a new airport, but to get from Central to the new airport, it needed a whole new infrastructure. And there were endless arguments about where and how we should achieve this. In the end, in '91, about the time I was appointed SFW, the agreement had been signed between China, United Kingdom, and Hong Kong that we would complete this project by 1997, 6 years. And it was done. How? It was done because Ford, being an army man, realized that command and control logistics had to be applied. The Airport Core Program was run by NAPCO, the New Airport Project Coordinating Committee, but most importantly, the Chief Secretary sat at the head of the major Airport Coordination Committee, so that the whole of the government department's expertise was committed through a command and control network. And that was basically, in my mind, the reason why the whole of the core project program was completed. $165 billion in those days, basically 6 years. And let me say, although the program had been put together by consultants, I think at the end of the day, it was a political decision that it had to be completed by '97 to the maximum extent possible. And it was done. As I say, to me, that is the single infrastructure program which underpins everything that we have done since then. Moving on, another interesting project to me personally was the Convention Center extension. Here, we had a problem. Thomson, Lydia Dunn had been pushing for an extension of the Convention Center, but to do that required reclamation, which was very difficult because the northern shore of the island in those days was quite polluted. So I was able to suggest to Hamish MacLeod, the financial secretary, we should put the extension on an island, keep the water clear for the future North Island Expressway. And that was done. As a result of which, from about 92 until 97, 5 years, the island reclamation was completed. The extension was designed and constructed. Interestingly, a lot of the units were fabricated in the Philippines, brought by sea into Hong Kong. These major trusses were actually lifted off of barges directly onto the land, onto the building, and then shuffled into place. So if you like, part of the success was the contractor's ability to use marine access and design, build for a fit purpose. So come 97, we finished. We had our banquet. Christopher Patton was satisfied. There were a few leaks, I'm afraid to say, but then these things will happen. And since then, of course, the leaks have been overcome. Moving on, railway development. This was interesting. Post-97, of course, I had to stand down, and my colleagues, HS and others, followed me as secretaries for works. So I moved on to railways, and I was fortunate to go into Kowloon Canton Railway. And we were in a position then to extend the railway system into the new territories. if you recall, at that time there was only the old Kowloon Canton Railway on the east side, no other railway transportation services. Government had taken the decision that everywhere had to be within about 10 or 15 minutes of a railway station. So KCRC were tasked with the job of expansion into the territories, and that was what we did for the next 6 years, particularly with railways. Was the question where to build them, how to build them. We decided to put them onto viaducts, and that was successfully done. The railway system basically was completed by 2003, and eventually, of course, the West Rail, East Rail extensions were merged operationally with with MTRC, where they rest today. Operationally, but I'm glad to see that Edmund, who's sitting there, is indeed the director of a very large railway asset portfolio, which has just been increased. So congratulations, Edmund. Moving on. This is really looking at fit for purpose. Why fit for purpose? Because these are railways. I often say that with a railway, it only needs a small nut and bolt to fail, and the whole railway system come to a grinding halt. And as you know, in Hong Kong, people expect lift service within 2 minutes. They expect trains within 3. And if they don't arrive, then they're, of course, are immediately reported. So, yes, we do have a better than 99% reliability of our railway system. And merging into Hong Kong, into MTRC, that was kept. But moving on now. Sorry, the slides are getting out of sequence. Go back a bit. We're back fit for purpose. Just looking at the 10 core projects we've spoken about already. Each and every one fit for purpose, and most importantly, to my mind, apart from the airport itself, which was dedicated under the Provisional Airport Authority, which I sat on, the remaining projects were all executed by government departments, coordinated, controlled, within a single program. And HS will tell us a lot about the bridge structures we see, because they all came through highways. But the reclamations, the airport itself, West Kowloon Crossing, and the great important thing was trust and transparency. Now, in those days, the decision was taken to implement a very strongly transparent public exercise in terms of keeping the public informed. You remember that the relations between the mainland, China, and the United Kingdom in those days were behind Hong Kong, and part of that relationship was the need to keep the Hong Kong public informed. So a lot of work was done, particularly keeping the Legislative Council informed regularly. Also, there was established another series of meetings which were open to the public. So a lot of the progress problems coming from the airport core program were made available to the public at large firsthand. Turning to MTR, because this was all going on in parallel. Norman Thompson and his executive colleagues, my old compadre Russell Black and others, were working on fully coordinated operational and construction interfaces. These were closely monitored, and they were measured against a direct program achievement and payment milestones being adopted for the whole of the work that they were doing. The early work, of course, was new to Hong Kong. A lot of the existing streets were taken over. Construction proceeded. Chater Road, Kwai Fong, Nathan Road. The works probably could not have been attempted these days. I suspect, Frank, you wouldn't have been able to get it through. But in those days, the people were there to trust us. And I think this is the important point, trust and transparency. The public in those days, because they were kept informed, grumbled, but they trusted us. They trusted MTRC. So MTRC were able to get on with the job, and they completed the railway, as we know, in stages into from the urban area and out towards Tuen Mun and so forth, across the island. But continuing with Fit for Purpose, we looked, the government and the railway corporations started to look at how transport interchanges could be used for housing purposes. One of the earliest examples, of course, was at Ho Tung, where the existing deck was ultimately used for development purposes. Kowloon Bay, similarly. Tuen Mun Depot, similarly. Perhaps 5% or so, 5 to 10% of Hong Kong's public housing stock, of development housing stock, private housing stock, is actually built over transport interchanges. A world first. London, other countries are beginning to follow us. But these were early days. Norman Thompson was a leading light in this area. Yuen Long, a lot of problems. Yuen Long with marble deposits, but we won't talk about that tonight because we did our best. I can only say this. If I recall correctly, we had piles in excess of 100 meters at some of those sites, and Thomas is nodding his head. And these are not small diameter. These were 2-meter diameter board piles. And at the bottom of the pile, we then had to drill, I recall, another 5 or 10 meters or so to make sure that there was solid marble underneath us without any further cavities. Otherwise, we just kept on digging. Please. Notwithstanding all of this success, there were problems. The Hong Kong government found it necessary to take action. Why? Because there was an incident with short piles, notwithstanding our 100-meter diameter piles, with some short piles. This created a loss of trust by the public at large in the construction industry at large. As a result of that, the government had to take action. An independent construction industry review committee was established under Henry Tang. And after 9 months or so, he published a comprehensive review, the Tang Report. This highlighted the shortcomings, which included, surprisingly or not, labor-intensive sites, dangerous, polluting working practices, fragmented trade skills, an adversarial culture, layered, uncoordinated contracting arrangements, poor safety, lax supervision. Where have we heard those words before? There were a package of 109 recommendations with the objective of lifting the performance of the industry, which called for concerted efforts from all stakeholders, government, client, consultants, contractors, subs, and professional institutions such as us. I believe today much has been achieved. I must say, Thomas, when I walk around your site at Ocean Park, it's a pleasure. The whole site is properly structured. The roadways for heavy trucks and transport are clearly separated from roadways. Every attempt is being made to make sure that safety, cleanliness are there day by day. And a site of that nature is also, to my mind, a site that will show good program performance. So I believe our industry at large has made some progress, a lot of progress. And site working, safe working, improved conditions does continue to be a strong focus. But, as we can see by recent events, there's no room for complacency. We've only got to make a misstep in the wrong direction, and we will have the public losing confidence, and we'll have our media colleagues with plenty to talk about or write in their columns. So, trust, transparency, to me, are really the name of the game. We can move on to slide 14. An interesting slide. Let me explain very quickly what you're looking at. This, in fact, is the Lockmouth Crossing at the end of Westrail. It was built in an area where, of course, conservation was of the highest degree. The contractor was required to take every measure, including precasting wherever possible. The site was kept clean. But interestingly, trust and transparency. The NGOs, of course, were still not completely satisfied. So we took the step here of putting CCTV cameras around the site. We linked those CCTV cameras back to the internet. So any one of the NGOs or their colleagues, if they wish to, could go and have a look at that site through those cameras at any time. We also invited representatives from the NGOs to attend relevant meetings between the contractor and ourselves. Did they come? I can't remember, frankly. I think some of them did, some of the time. But at least the offer was there. And that made them comfortable that we were going to try and set out to do what we had said we would do. We would build in a way which did not impinge upon a very sensitive environmental area. And also, in the Lockmouth Station concourse, there are indeed telescopes so that the public at large can look over the area. And one final point, as MTR will grumble about, it is a condition of the operating permit that the measures agreed at the time of construction and built into the operating license be maintained. So the point about all of this is we can achieve stakeholder agreements. We can bring trust and transparency with us if we go that little bit extra every time. The Lockmouth the West Rail basically was put onto viaducts through the green area, but also most of its length, because viaducts avoided embankments. Embankments would create flooding, and flooding would lead to anguish on the part of the local population. The viaducts had floating track slabs to deal with the noise issues. So these things on a sort of trust and transparency process can be implemented if some sort of care and attention is paid to the issue. Turning now a little bit to challenges, opportunities. The government colleagues, of course, in the meantime, have been doing a lot of work, a great deal of work, as we can see. I mean, where in the world can you look at two bridges of such nature, three bridges, in fact, Qingma, Cap Samun and Taitan, from one viewing perspective. But also, MTR, when they built the cable car, because of site access, they had to bring mules into Hong Kong. Russell once told me that job could not have been built without mules. So it's not only the latest technology which needs to be employed. We must put our minds back to what is an opportunity to build with a minimum of anguish on the landscape. The Stonecutters treatment plant, I remember involvement at the very early stages when we were trying to work out what to do with all of the treated water that would come out of that plant. At one stage, it was thought that we could push this offshore into the deep channels south of Hong Kong, but our mainland counterparts were not very happy with that. So there was a meeting which I held with mainland, and we reached an agreement that there was need for further study, which was done. And as a result of that, the agreement how to dispose of the treated material. But this, to me, is, again, an example of how the Drainage Services Department gets on and does these major projects, deep tunnels. Yes, there was one or two problems, but at the end of the day, we've managed to get to a point where a lot of the harbour is now clean enough for the cross-harbour swim, and that would not have been possible without the energy, the effort, and the professionalism rising to these challenges. Moving on to another subject which we are all aware of, but perhaps we do not take too much credence for. We recall in 1972 the Poshan landslip, which resulted, and I'm glad to see my old friend sitting down there smiling to himself, the establishment of the Office of Government that became responsible for slope management, geotechnical engineering. They celebrated their 40 years quite recently, I think it's last year. And looking back, of course, the Poshan Road resulted in the establishment of that office. It resulted in Evan and Tony creating a system of evaluating landslip risk and measures. But despite all of that, I remember coming back from leave one day to be told that, at night time, Kunlun had a major, well, in fact, it looks bigger than it is, but the interesting thing about this landslip is that it was fairly localized, but it resulted in a fatality. But what was, to me, more important was moving onto the site at around 2 o'clock in the morning. The high-rise building foundations were exposed. There was a worry. How critical was that in terms of a building where so much work and activity was going on below? But nevertheless, as a result of this, the safety management program with intermittent review, we brought in international expertise. A slope safety technical review board was set up in '95. And the past 2 decades since then, I think slope engineering and landslip risk management in Hong Kong has reached a very high level of reliability and safety. Now, for the public who need to live in these high-rise conditions, in the times of torrential rainstorms, they look around the world, they see what happens in other countries, and it probably gives them some sense of security that in Hong Kong we have managed so far to control the situation. And I believe with the work that has been done by the Technical Review Board, Ben Enstam and others, We have a worldwide reputation in this area, and I'm sure that this reputation will stand us in good stead into the future. Emerging technologies, hospitals in particular. I recall after Prince Edward, one of the hospitals, which took a long time to complete, the then Secretary for Health came to me and said, how can we deal with North District Hospital? The resulting decision was to go for a design build rather than the conventional design and build. The reason for that was, again, coming back fit for purpose. It meant that Health Bureau were able, the Secretary for Health, were able to go to the doctors, to go to the specialists in the hospital, get them to state their requirements. Their requirements were cast in stone on documentation. When they went to LegCo, this brief was already in place, and it was not just a question of design, it was a question of design, build for operation. So the actual program ran through until such time as the operating part of that design build document was complete. That worked very successfully. I think it's been done since then. I think the Children's Hospital is now also, and there are a number of other examples. Looking at the artistic impression of Kai Tak Sports Park, it may not look anything like this because the tenders are now being studied. They have been given a reference scheme, and I would stress again the importance of a reference scheme. I can assure you that Home Affairs, with their consultants, have spent the best part of 4 years developing a reference scheme for the sports park. We don't know. The contracted party may in fact tear up that work, throw it away. But I would say it was absolutely essential to do. It set the guidelines very clearly, what the government wanted through the operating stage. As in a railway, there was no doubt about the client's intentions. And when it comes to setting things like performance indices, the operate stage of the sports park is going to be very complex. People have got to attract organizations from overseas, not like a railway with a given patronage. There, the patronage has got to be built. But there needs to be performance indices, and those performance indices need to be set against the client's requirements, the client's reference scheme. That was in the tender documentation. It will be interesting to see how the tenderers are responding to that. We will know, hopefully, by the end of the year, that we have got a contracted party who understands not only the design, but also he's got to make the design fit for purpose. Moving on. Emerging technologies, again. Programming and planning software these days is becoming incredibly sophisticated. I talk to my Gammon colleagues often about this. We sit around a desk and they are able to produce information across the desk, which in the old days was probably not possible. And Walter, I think you will agree with me. In the old days, we could not get to the level of detail that you are able to examine today when you are sitting with Gammon, exploring the work in progress and the work that lays ahead of us. And I think that this is where, into the future, we have got to do a lot more. The mobile hand devices that we have are, of course, making it possible for us to do our office work on site if we have to. And that, to me, would be a good thing, because one of the problems today, so many interfaces, so much paperwork. I'm afraid a lot of you guys spend your days sitting in site offices attending to paperwork rather than getting out on site. And remember, I think it was Confucius, who said, you can tell me something and I will listen. You can show me something, I will look, but let me touch, then I will understand. I don't believe any of us can really understand what problems are in front of us unless we get onto the site. We see for ourselves. We touch to the extent that we watch others trying to complete an activity. We realize perhaps that the original design was not fit for purpose. It was not buildable. And if anything, that is the one thing I would recommend to all of you young guys here tonight. Get out, look at what's going on. If you don't do that, I'm afraid you will not really understand the project and the problems. When I started my career, I worked in a drawing office. There was a drawing board and there was a T-square and there were pencils and ink, and we used to practice printing. I used to operate a print machine, and in the spare time I used to try to produce a reasonable standard with drawings. But I can tell you, we also had to think in 3 dimensions, because we were trying to detail structural steelwork connections, where you had to insert bolts in those days and nuts, and you had to be able to tie them up. It's good practice, good because it makes you think in 3 dimensions. And if you didn't, the chances were that you'd have a big steelwork erector standing next to your drawing board, asking in fairly strong, vivid language who it was that had produced this particular detail that they had been expected to complete on site. These days, that's done by computers, all your 3D image. So use it. But remember, it is part of the process of producing a fit-for-purpose drawing and or fit-for-purpose information which is going to be used on site. But in the design process, there is also the software. I believe, again, you need to be able to visualize what your expected output is when you plug something into your computer. In my days, we tried to do it with slide rules and coefficients and tables and so forth. These days, you plug a need into a computer and something comes out the other end. But I'm afraid I still believe in the old axiom, what was it? Rubbish in, rubbish out. It still applies. If you guys don't know what you expect to see at the end of it, you are going to be in trouble. So to de-risk the problem, avoid complete reliance upon any technology, make sure you do enough reading. Go to the Civils Library in London if you wish. Do enough reading to understand the models, the nature of the design, particularly, of course, when it comes to 3-dimensional visualization of connections, rebar, and so forth. When we rebuilt the club, the Hong Kong club, my project manager was quoted as saying that trying to manipulate some of the high-strength 40-millimeter diameter bars into some of Harry Seidler's structure was like knitting. The steel fixers literally sat on the end of the beams with a small jig, and they had to literally tweak these bars into a position where they could assemble them into a final assembly. We have a similar problem, I suspect, recently, but anyway, that's not for tonight. Be careful. Make sure that what you are presenting is fit for purpose and is buildable. I was interested in this slide because, don't go too quickly. On the one hand, I wanted to put this up because the government is pushing industry now to go forward with digital engineering, to go forward with building information management. Our institution in London, of course, has been pushing for this in the United Kingdom for some time now, successfully. The UK government has taken up that lead, and the Hong Kong government equally, with this circular, has made it clear that digital engineering is a thing of the future. We looked at this, when I say we, the ICE, at the annual conference as long ago as 2015. Ken, I think, edited this book. There's a whole section on building information and digital engineering. The interesting thing about this tunnel, this picture, is it reminds me of going down in the old days, what we used to call caissons. You may not remember them. Some of these things used to go down about 30 or 40 meters. It's quite an experience like this, to go down to the bottom on the, or sitting or standing on the bucket, and look at the bottom, look at the ground underneath, and decide whether the caisson needed to go down any further. And to remember that men worked down there, and they were men because their wives were up top looking after them. So, it's an interesting slide, but these emerging technologies are there for us to use. If we don't use them, I'm afraid our problems with short piles or whatever are going to continue to come back and haunt us. Moving on a little bit, once more, I'd like just now to say thank you to Gammon, because they're going to show us a little bit with another slide about how BIM is being used at the sports park. But just to say, it is, and to me, Walter, an incredibly complex piece of work. We have got these slopes, which look fairly placid here, but they are quite steep at the interface with the building. We have got a shell roof in layers, one above the other. We have got water retaining structures both outside and inside. We have got these water slides around the building. Some of the slides actually finish up inside the building, and they're quite high structures. So the interface between the designer, between buildings ordnance, geotechnical engineering, has been incredibly complex. It's a small structure, but I believe it is a very, very complex structure. As a result of that, Thomas and his staff have used building information management extensively from day one. And so I'm pleased today that they're now going to show us a little bit, a very short snapshot about how they put this BIM together. This will be a slide that speaks for itself in the main. Obviously, baseline setting up, representing how the columns, and I can assure you that this is actually what it looked like on site. The columns were appearing on site. Areas of slab were being constructed on site according to program at different levels. And of course, the site management were able to plan their day-to-day activities in terms of scaffolding, and particularly on this site, how to put your scaffolding in without getting it trapped so that you can't get it out again. So the whole thing has been done from virtually beginning to end. These are the last of the shell roofs that I showed you going up on top. In the center of the shell roof, there are these panels. And of course, you've also got your tower cranes to be removed at the appropriate time. But on the other hand, the last of the tower cranes is needed not only for structural purposes to put the roof, complete the roof, but also to assist in placing those water slides around the slopes. So an incredible piece, to my mind, of digital engineering has enabled this project to proceed to the extent where it is today. Walter might disagree with me, but I think, Walter, we have to say well done to the contractor in this respect. So, where are we? Our concluding remarks. I thought I'd show you this slide. Obviously, we need to have Thomas Telford, our president, our first president of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Thomas was responsible for the Menai Suspension Bridge. And I suspect BIM was not used for that, and I suspect that the drawings were much simpler than the drawings that we are used to today. In fact, I have seen a bridge of this sort represented on one single sheet of paper, including the test loading afterwards. So he was also, of course, a man who was responsible for much of the infrastructure that was completed in his lifetime in and around the United Kingdom. He became the first president of the institution, and so he deserves a place on this concluding slide. The gentleman on the right, of course, I have to pay homage to because he's called there Tian Yao Jim, but in fact it's Jim Tin Yao. And the Jim is, of course, my family name, Jim. The reason that happened was I was working on, I think it was Chatham Road site, with some fellow engineers. I didn't have a Chinese name at that time, and they suggested that this name, Jim, might be an interesting family name for me. Some recollection of railways. It was a railway-related project. The bucklock comes from horses. Now, I don't know anything about horses, but of course it does mean you expected to know something about people. So perhaps Jim Bucklock for me and Jim Tin Yao. He was sent to America. He was the first Chinese to be involved in railway construction. Not up until his time, railways had been the preserve of foreign entities. For example, Jim Tin Yao had, can't see. No. There was a very famous UK engineer, yes, Kinder. Kindler was, again, ICE. He was one of the UK engineers who did a lot of railway work, and he was a mentor for Jim Tin Yao. Jim Tin Yao went to the States, came back, and the Chinese government said, we're fed up with foreigners, we want somebody to build our first railway. So he was given the job of building the first railway in China. He also, interestingly, is said to have cast his eye over the Chinese section of the Lowu crossing. The Lowu Bridge, if you remember, is partly Hong Kong and partly China, and he is said to have had something to do with that. So he deserves a place. The gentleman in the middle, Michael Wright, is an architect. Why is he there? He was born in Hong Kong. He grew up. He was imprisoned in Hong Kong. He went on to become a senior member of the Hong Kong government. And Michael dedicated his life to Hong Kong. It was as Director of Public Works in those days, where the whole of the infrastructure side of government came under a director. It was a very powerful organization. But Michael was the Director of Public Works. And in particular, of course, with his colleagues, he was responsible for much of the low-cost housing that was put up very rapidly to remove some of those household hillside conditions. When they had the major fires, they had to build quickly and house people as quickly as they could. It was Michael and his team that was largely responsible as a driver for this. So, architect, yes, but like us, trying to use the forces of nature for the benefit of mankind. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, that brings the slide presentation to an end. I hope that I've given you a little snapshot of what has taken place in Hong Kong this past half century. But remember, keep it simple. And the pointers, again, that I would make whenever we talk about these things are fitness for purpose, command and control, trust, and transparency. I think with those 3 pointers in your mind, you won't go very far wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, for the inspiring lecture. Please remain on stage for the panel discussion. Following this fascinating lecture, we will have a panel discussion. And we're very, very lucky to have a very interesting panel this evening featuring many key leaders from the industry. While the helpers are setting up the panel, let me introduce them one by one. So of course we have our distinguished lecturer, James, and together with James we have Mr. C.S.Y., Managing Director of Urban Renewal Authority. Mr. Thomas Ho, Chief Executive of Gammon Construction Limited. Professor Ken Ho, Chairman of the ICE Hong Kong Association. And we also have Mr. Tony Sham. He's the moderator of the panel.
So, first of all, thank you, James, for excellent presentation. And thank you, Ken and CS and Thomas, for joining James in the panel discussion. Well, in the lecture, James has talked about a number of pointers, the three in particular: fitness, purpose, command and control, and trust and transparency. And you talk about emerging technologies as well. And I think, in particular, I think command and control and trust and transparency seems to be the hot topic recently. CS. May I kick off the discussion by asking you to give us your views on trust and transparency? How do you see that?
Before I respond to your question, I would like to thank Jim Barlow, right, for a very insightful summary of what has happened in the past 50 years in our construction industry. And for those who might have forgotten me, I am a civil engineer. And our guest of honor today, in fact, he is also an engineer, Chen Fan, Secretary Chen Fan, but he's not a civil engineer, an electrical engineer. Now, coming back to the question, trust and transparency, to me, are very difficult subjects because there is not a simple formula that an engineer can follow to deal with those issues. Now, we can look at trust and transparency from many different angles. TNT among the contracting parties, TNT between, trust and transparency between the industry and the community, and TNT between our profession and the community. Now, because of limited time, I'll just touch on the first one, TNT among the contracting parties. I had been promoting the use of a collaborative form of contract when I was the Deputy Secretary for Works back in 2004, until I retired in 2015. I'm happy to see that this new engineering contract, which is a collaborative form of contract, will be used more extensively in government contracts. The collaborative form of contract will enhance trust and transparency among the employer, the contractor, and the consultant. And it will also enhance the contract performance because, to me, transparency through genuine communication among the contracting parties, collaboration, and trust characterize the key features of a successful contract. Now, the other point that I want to make is that to improve the effectiveness of a collaborative form of contract, the use of a suitable form of insurance is also very important. Just imagine when a project team look at a problem, a difficult problem in particular, with looking for a coordinated solution to a difficult problem among the client, the consultant, and contractor, but then the project team do not know who will, at the end of the day, be held responsible or liable for that solution. Now, I think if we have got a properly draft insurance program, it would assist a lot. And I think James knows very well the owner control insurance program that was used in the ACP, I think is a very useful experience. So when we have time, we can talk about TNT for from the other angles.
Thank you, CS. Any other panel members here would like to make a response or comment on trust and transparency before we move on to another pointer, perhaps?
So thank you. I think in terms of transparency, I think these days, I think we need to think about what technology can help us. You look into, I think, what elsewhere in the world, people are, when they are looking at sort of complex sort of project, they all are advocating how can we do this collaboration model from the sort of design to the facility management. So in the UK, I think together with ICE, they have created some project called the Project 13. So each project will be practicing, I think, the best sort of practices. So I've been able to look into one of the sort of project, look like our HEADS scheme. So they are adopting a sort of collaborative model called ProjectWise. Then they're really able to make the transparency using BIM model, the client, the main contractors, the supply chain, together with the facility management. So jointly can own that model, jointly can use that model for the benefit of the whole total life cycle or asset management. And when I talk to the sort of the project team, they're able to use this model to shorten the design sort of cycle from 24 months to sort of 18 months. Some 6 months have been approved or have been shortened. But in addition, is the sort of information engineer who is sort of presenting to us. He may be graduated from ICE, 2-3 years of experience. But what he can sort of demonstrate is how he can use this technology together with the team and then design, I think, the means and method is to so much of the detail that they can prefabricate all the unit and then make sure that that would be buildable, not just, I think, rest in the sort of design stage. And then in order to do this, exactly what I think James had been sort of looking at, you really need to sort of walk the site, understand what is really the basic needs of the operation. Then you're really able to beam the joint into the LOD 500. Then you can do that exercise. And these days in the UK, it's not just, I think, the engineer who will be going to do this. Again, in Crossrail, the architect can, again, at the very early stage, can beam the joint, beam the subframe, beam all the sequence to really to make sure that the whole process would be shortened. This is really, I think, a sort of game changer for the whole industry. And when I look at, I mean, the Global McKinsey report, they are telling us, you do AI, you do all these things. Maybe, I think, you can save maybe 4 or 5% of the overall construction cost. But then if you are able to do this collaboration model, this one-stop shop approach, you can really improve 10 times or tenfold on the productivity and your construction cost. And I think there's a lot that we should learn.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. James, you want to
yeah, can I just
make a response?
Just comment. I think Thomas is hitting the nail on the head as usual. Emerging technology enables us now to share this information with confidence, because before we were guessing. Now, to a large extent, it's no longer guesswork. It's an analysis based upon the output from programming, from input from all of the project-related issues. But let me take you back. There was one stage, and when I say trust and transparency, I mentioned during the whole of the Airport Core program, there was a great deal of effort put into transparency at that for that whole of that project, a great deal of effort. I think government realized that if it was going to succeed, it had to have the property with it. So a great deal of effort went onto that side. But then I also recall there was some work going on above the Truman Highway. We got a call one evening, that there'd been a major piece of rock had rolled down onto the highway. I think there had been an accident. I was sent out to have a look, and it was obvious to me that here the forces of nature had overcome the best efforts of the people on site. The boulders that were being split had split into pieces much larger than anticipated, so the temporary restraint was just incapable of holding back these pieces of rock. Consequently, one was on the road, the whole of the highway was closed. When I called the CS, I said, look, this is a risk that is going to continue. The only way is to close the road, deal with the risk, and then reopen. And she said, well, how long will that take? I said, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks. And that's what we did. We were transparent with the public at large. I took the journalists out the next morning, and they asked me the same question. You want to close the road? How long is it going to be closed? I said, maybe a couple of weeks. The contractor made the effort and got the work completed in 12 days, I think. But the result of that decision was that a major risk was overcome because we were transparent about the problem. The follow-up to this is, years later, I was parking my car and the car jockey said to me, oh, he said, you were backlogged. No, you were secretary for work. No? He said, you closed the road. I said, yes. He said, you did the right thing, he said. And I was delighted because he recognized that there was a risk. And had we not closed the road, that risk would have continued. So transparency, I believe, is don't be afraid to be transparent. That's my message. If it results in the need to stand up and be counted, just do it. But remember also, a problem shared is usually a problem solved.
Okay, thank you. Let's give Ken a chance. Ken, CS talked about trust and transparency, and Thomas made comments on emerging technology. What's your view on command and control?
Thank you, Tony. I think we have to recognize that control of the design and construction of engineering works by the Hong Kong government plays an important role in the risk management process. As regards the quality of design, government sets technical standards, stipulates professional qualifications requirements and QA requirements, and the regulators vet the design submissions with a view to protecting public safety. As regards quality of the works, the authorities stipulate site supervision requirements and conduct unannounced site audits. So this is the control system. Whilst the system has served the industry well in overall terms, the way the system is generally administered in practice has thrown up some questions from time to time. Let me highlight a few points for discussion's sake. Firstly, there are allegations that the control system is stifling innovations, as it can be very difficult to get approval for innovative ideas, new approaches, or new materials. Secondly, regulators tend to be risk averse and may have an inclination to push for a safer design involving more conservative assumptions in order to reduce the design risk. At the same time, designers are often under pressure to obtain prompt approval, which, for expediency and perhaps saving in design cost, might be done with a more conservative design. This state of affairs may not be in the best interest of value engineering or buildability, and it could in fact give rise to a higher construction risk, especially with geotechnical works. Thirdly, the standard of the individual independent checking engineers for public works projects can vary considerably in practice, with no mechanism for feedback on their performance. Collapses of temporary works have occurred from time to time. Currently, there is no systematic means of disseminating what went wrong and the lessons learned. as the construction industry is now actively promoting the application of innovation and technology, should we consider reviewing the control system and any outdated regulations? If so, what are the priority areas for enhancement?
Okay, thank you. Right, I think it's bad and indeed sad if the regulatory control becomes a barrier to innovation, as you described. Anyone would like to make any response to that?
Not a response. I'm suffering from from too much control. As a retired permanent secretary, my colleagues in the government department are not really giving me face. I'm now responsible for the repair of the central market. I want to use some, well, so-called innovative material, although it has been used for quite a number of years in other parts of the world, fiber reinforced polymer. I'm still struggling to get approval from the relevant government departments. Now, control, I think the purpose of control is to reduce risk. So we need control. But on the other hand, innovation almost always introduces risk. So, these are working against each other. I don't know how to solve the problem. But this is the 41st anniversary of my working life. And I have a puzzle in mind, which I still do not have an answer. Why do we need, why is a group of engineers, professional engineers, being controlled by another group of professional engineers using a monitoring system or control system being devised by a third group of engineers? Now, if you had a surgery, you would not appoint a doctor to supervise another team of doctors to carry out the surgery. If you are involved in a lawsuit, you will not employ a team of lawyers to monitor the performance of another team of lawyers working for you. So Ken mentioned, should we review this control system? I think we should. Why should engineers supervising engineers? When I was still with the government, I did look at this self-certification arrangement. So instead of passing, instead of going back to ask my colleagues to get an approval, can I have a self-certification arrangement? I think this is something that perhaps the engineering community should look into in a bit more detail.
Well, in my experience, I think is sometimes it's not so much the control system, but it's the people. And say, for instance, for us as consultants, if a client would like to have an innovative design, I think I would make sure that we put the right people on the right job. So I think perhaps from the regulatory control body's point of view, maybe consider setting up a task force to deal with innovative approvals or something like that. Okay, so
can I make one?
Sure,
one
James.
comment? I tend to, of course, I agree with you. I don't believe it's the end product that is the problem. I think the regulatory system that we have in place in Hong Kong is basically fit for purpose. What I would say is that the process of applying that regulatory process is now out of date. We work to time bites to get things done, simply because in the old days, nobody could be quite sure how much time would be needed, how much work would be involved, what the resources available were, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that as we move into our sort of digital age, as we move into our age where we get so much reliable information coming in front of us, it's not only the contractor and the site representative or the project director who use that information. I think somehow, yes, we've got to bring the government agencies into that same process. The BIM process should not stop at the site. It should not stop at the designer. It should go right the way through to the controlling authority. Maybe in the beginning there will be some problems, I'm sure. But basically, since government is now telling the industry, build twice, once off-site once on site. The off-site process should involve the regulatory process. The people involved will be much happier because their working day will probably become much more realistic. They will know in advance where the pressures are going to come from. They will be able to plan accordingly. So that would be my suggestion. Go right back to the regulatory process with the design building information management system that we know can deliver.
Yes, James. Obviously, the process has to be improved, but the regulations has to be improved as well. Again, I'm suffering. The building ordinance, for those who are involved with building ordinance,
Walter,
if you require more than 300 practice notes to support an ordinance, then that ordinance must be out of date. So somebody we have to look at how to improve that part of the regulations. Now again, the beam. We have been talking about the beam. If the building ordinance require you to submit 2D drawings for approval, then even if you use beam for all the other parties, you still cannot get around this 2D problem, right? You still have to convert the 3D into a 2D submission for approval. So we are talking about MIC, right, modular construction, but if the approval process has not yet been adapted to such a method of construction, still you get stuck. So both the regulation and the process have to
Thoroughly
change.
agree. Yes, you cannot let the process stand still. Today's process was yesterday's. What we're looking at with BIM is a process into the future. They can move together. Quite agree.
Okay, well, I will request ICE to pay some more money to hire a couple more wireless microphone because I like to have some interaction with us, but I'm so sorry that because of time, we have to cancel that. So one last question, of course, to James. James, with your almost 60 years involvement with Hong Kong, what's your most gratifying experience? Can you share that with us?
Gratifying, memorable. I would have to say, having retired from the railway, it was quite a challenge to receive a telephone call one evening from a familiar voice telling me that I would have to go back to the railway because there were some problems to sort out, which I did. And I have to say, it was rewarding in the sense that my former railway colleagues were pleased to see me, and I was happy to be back. My chairman was also cautious, but then eventually happy to see me. And we formed an excellent relationship, which lasted throughout the whole of the remaining operational life of KCRC through into the operational merger. So if anything stands out in my mind, it was receiving a telephone call at home in the evening around about 8 o'clock telling me that it was necessary to go back to the railway. Could I come to the office the next day to talk about it?
Great. Well, I believe we have had some very lively and enjoyable discussions. Thank you very much, James, C.S., Thomas, and Ken. Let's give them a big round of applause. So this concludes the panel discussion.
May I just make one
yeah.
point? The presentation was not put together, obviously, without a great deal of assistance from Ken and all of his colleagues. I can't go through them all by name, but I would, and they know who they are, say thank you to them all. It was a job well done. I enjoyed it, and I hope we all got the same pleasure. I hope Ken and yours.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, Johnny.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. May I now invite Professor Ken Ho to present some souvenirs to our speakers. Ken, please. First of all, we have Mr. James Blake, our distinguished lecturer. And next we have Mr. CSY. And we also have Mr. Thomas Ho. Thank you. What about a group photo with all the panelists? Thank you, gentlemen. Please take a seat. Thank you. May I now invite Professor C.K. Mack, Vice President International of ICE, to propose a vote of thanks. Professor Mack, please.
Frank, James, Tony, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, fellow ICE members, good evening. It is my privilege to have been asked to give the closing remarks on this occasion. On behalf of the ICE Hong Kong A, the organizer, and the Institution of Civil Engineers, I want to extend a very hearty thanks to James. I must mention, as reflected by the reaction of the audience, our deep appreciation for the message he has given us in his distinguished lecture this evening. James has been my friend. He's my senior, he's my colleague and mentor. And as I say, I'm honored that he has counted me as one of his good friends. He's definitely the most appropriate person to speak on the topic of pointers to success tonight, when so many things have happened recently in the engineering community in Hong Kong. History is, of course, important. It connects the past with the future. James reminds us not to read history, but to learn from history. And from that, his message has given us very timely, and indeed, to some, could be a wake-up call when so many successful projects implemented in the past might have blinded us from looking at project constraints critically and devising proper means to handle them. James point out the 3 pointers. I think this is something we can bring home. But in all his illustration, it makes very clear to us that engineering projects are by nature challenging and full of uncertainties. Projects start from proper planning, and then proper procurement and proper delivery. The entire process demands the highest professionalism, passion, and preparedness, so that unexpected circumstances during the actual implementation can be properly handled, resolved, and eventually completed without fault. Making changes to suit the actual conditions are not uncommon. And civil engineers are, of course, technical experts and problem solvers. We are trained to face problems resolutely, to apply our knowledge and skills to tackle them. And more than that, to explain to laymen and the general public why certain actions should be taken and how the solution will bring home satisfactory results and outcome. Unfortunately, things do not always happen as planned. We need to be good communicators also. That is, civil engineers are not just technical men. In the urbanized setting in Hong Kong, we are project administrators. We really have to administer projects. We are public engagers. We have to engage the public. And in short, I say we are the urban managers looking after our built environment. We have to, and we will engage the public by telling them clearly the details of the project and in a way that is easily understood by the general public, what James mentioned in one of his pointers. This lecture is part of ICE Hong Kong A's contribution to celebrate ICE 200 years. Yes, we should celebrate the past 200 years, inspire the next 200, and help create the future. It is our duty as civil engineers to persuade the general public that civil engineers protect and transform their lives. Our actions are fundamental to creating the necessary environment that enables the general public to live their life in the way they want. To echo James' 3 pointers, I always ask my colleagues, what exactly is the value of infrastructure? After leaving the government, I teach in the university, I also ask my students, what is the value of infrastructure? Can you say it in one word? So to echo James' point, we would take 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to build a piece of infrastructure. But from the commissioning of that infrastructure, it would go on for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So the one word that I have in mind is the function of the project. Can the project function properly? If it doesn't function, why build it? Thank you again, James. It was a perfect evening to listen to your inspiring lecture, which is full of insight and wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CK. I'd like to just share with you some news about the next and final lecture. It will be held in mid-December. And the theme or the topic of the next lecture is a rather long one. Civil engineers protect and transform lives from high-speed growth to quality development, the Hong Kong story. And our keynote speaker for our next and final lecture is the one who just addressed us with the vote of thanks, Professor C.K. Mack, VP International of ICE. So don't miss the opportunity and stay tuned for further announcement from the institution. Johnny, I know you got something to announce as well.
Yes, Tony, thanks. The ICE organized the People's Choice Award every year. And in 2018, the awards include international projects as a celebration of the ICE200. And recently, the ICE has announced the 10 finalists. And I'm pleased to share with you that the Harbour Area Treatment Scheme, in short HACS, of DST Hong Kong has been shortlisted. And voting will start on the 10th of September, as you can see from the slide, until the 28th of September. This is also the only project from Hong Kong and East Asia to be shortlisted. And the voting is open to the public, so I encourage you, your family, your friends, and everyone around you to cast your vote in September. And every voter has a chance of winning a Fitbit watch. And for more details, please refer to the little postcard inside your plastic folder. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Finally, I'd just like to say very quickly, thank you to a number of organizations and people. First of all, I'd like to thank the support of the HKIE, Civil and Geotechnical Division, the ASCE, CSCE, and the Lighthouse Club in promoting this event to their members. Special thanks to the staff of the Hong Kong Association of ICE, Jenny, Crystal, and the other assistants, and to my ex-colleagues at AECOM, Ivy, and our MC tonight, Johnny, and other helpers. And of course, James and our panel members, and of course, Secretary Chen, and every one of you for your attendance. So take care and see you next time in December.
Yeah, look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Good night.